Okay, hello again, historiography students. I'm Eric Morningstar, obviously. And today we're going to talk about nature's metropolis, Chicago, and the Great West by William Cronon. Now, this book was published in 91, and, this edition is heavy enough to break your ganglion cysts. As always, I'm going to be talking about the author's purpose. I'm going to offer some comments to summarize the book, and then I will get to my critiques and comments to tie it to the core concept of the dialectic. Now, before I begin, I'm going to share a couple of comments that I made this week while talking to other people, and they are related to this reading. One, that I said, my choice of home is either going to be a 19th century farmhouse or something that's incredibly modern and industrial, like a loft space. The other comment is that I feel like we live in a time where we're kind of uncomfortable with ambiguity and ambivalence. And I think that both of these are related to my reading of this book. The latter is going to come back in some of my critiques. Now, that tangent being over, I want to talk about the author's purpose. If you are following along, it gives a pretty good summation of this on the first page of the preface. I'm going to read a quote. My contention is that no city, Chicago, played a more important role in shaping the landscape and economy of the mid-continent during the second half of 19th century than Chicago. One cannot understand the growth of Chicago without understanding its special relationship to the vast region lying to its west. The central story of 19th century West is that of an expanding metropolitan economy creating ever more elaborate and intimate linkages between city and country. Now, to see the traditional American frontier from this metropolitan perspective, no place furnishes a more striking vantage point than Chicago. Now, on 16 and 17 of the preface, he also says, this is going to be a combination of environmental and economic history, which is very obvious. He probably better states his purpose probably later in the book. And this comes at the bottom of 264 and then on to 265. And here he states, at the heart of this new system was the twin birth of city and hinterland. Neither was possible without the other. Before Chicago became a metropolis, one could have described the processes of ecological change in the landscape of the west of the Great Lakes without making any reference to that particular place. It's a very long quote, so I'm going to go ahead and stop there. But really, what I take to mean from this, to be the purpose of this book, is city and country inform each other. You can't separate the environment from the creation of cities. In that way, it's very much like Burdell. The idea here doesn't go like into a longue durée necessarily in this book, although he does spend some time talking about the movement of glaciers and how that kind of helped construct the environment. And he spends basically the entirety of chapter 1 to talk about that. That chapter being titled Dreaming the Metropolis. And as I said, moving from glaciers to the usages of the land by the Potawatomi and how it was taken, and then to discuss the theories of urban and rural growth that led up to the building of a city. And he discusses a number of them. He discusses Frederick Jackson Turner, von Thunen, I hope that I'm pronouncing that correctly. If not, I'm sorry. And the concept of the isolated state, and also the boosters who promoted development. Especially interesting is his discussion of the boosters. According to Cronon, boosters believe that climate, this is a quote, boosters believe that climate, soils, vegetation, and transportation routes and other features of the landscape all pointed toward key locations that nature had designated for urban greatness. That's on 35. On 36, he ties this booster ideology to ideas like of God's providence. So it's kind of teleological in nature. It's kind of a reinvention of like the shining city on the hill that brought people to the colonies. He expands this idea in talking about how the boosters really saw London as the current example of a great metropolis, and that London was the heir to Rome. So there's kind of like a classical allusion to these great urban cities in the past, and it's like, oh, here, develop in Chicago. In terms of Turner's philosophy, he kind of saw the development of the city as the end point of rural development. And von Thunen, on the other hand, postulated this concept of the isolated city, where you have a city in the center and concentric zones around that city, where you have, the closer you are, the more intensive agriculture that you're engaged in. And on the outskirts, you have things like hunting and trapping, relations with Native Americans, that kind of thing. Now, moving into chapter 2, Cronon discusses basically how the land was worked and reshaped. It's the story of the taming of the land. A lot of specific actions took place to build Chicago. On 62, Cronon kind of brings this together with his main purpose that, you can't separate the environment from the city. The first and the second nature, where first nature in this book is, nature as we would commonly think of it. Outside, trees, plains, fields to be worked. And second city kind of second nature represents the city, and how man acts upon the first nature to develop cities and towns, villages. So, like I said, on 62, he's kind of brings it back to the boosters' idea of environmental determinism. Cronon disagrees, pointing out that natural avenues of transportation might play important roles in shaping a city's future. But the pre-existing structures of the human economy, second nature, not first nature, determined which routes in which cities developed most quickly. I think Brodell might have something to say about that, but it's an interesting point. Chapter 3 really discusses the grain. This whole book is kind of structured based on commodities, how humans had a relationship to things, specifically wheat, lumber, and meat. Those are the three that are emphasized most in the book. In terms of grain, it's a very kind of long history of how we move from shipping grain upriver to the development of specific technologies that make Chicago this kind of epicenter of grain trade. One of those technological advancements was the telegraph. He discusses this on 122. It was difficult when you're sending, pardon me, grain upriver and or downriver to these separate cities because travel time is an issue, spoilage. Pardon me. So people could get information from the east and other areas of the country much faster, a couple hours, but compared to several days of waiting on messages and what prices were going to be for grain in other areas. In addition, they developed a scale. When they're sending them upriver, they have to be in these watertight sacks. So it's grain per unit is measured in volume, and pardon, makes it kind of hard to determine grades or anything because different higher grades of wheat will weigh more than lower grades of wheat, and people were kind of noticing that. So they worked to develop elevator scales and weighing them, so it was by weight. And he also discusses in this, why Chicago and why not other cities, right? Why not St. Louis? Well, one of the reasons there being the environment again. Chicago's close relationship to Lake Michigan and stuff like that made it easier to, people near in the West, the Great West, to bring stuff to Chicago and not, send it down to other cities because one, spoilage and time and everything else. So in St. Louis, when they were developing the elevator technology, it basically came down to, well, the investors weren't sure that it was going to be super profitable, so we're not going to invest in the elevator technology to make, grain as important in St. Louis as in Chicago. So again, first nature informs second nature. Chapter 3, moving on to lumber, or 4, moving on to lumber. This was kind of an interesting chapter to read, given that we're in Michigan here. Michigan has that rich logging industry history. Now, and it's basically the same story, right? We have tons of white pine in the areas around Chicago. And white pine was basically the resource that fueled the lumber industry. It was interesting, he points out that one person said that the process of depleting the environment would take centuries. And as we learn reading the book, they basically exhausted the white pine in less than a century. And that's kind of the story, right? And in the same way that grain developed, so did the lumber industry, moving the stuff upriver and eventually the development of railroads. But it was, again, sort of an exhausting, a tale about the exhaustion of the lumber resources. In chapter 5, we learn a lot about meat. In particular, hogs, cattle, and bison, especially. Now, this chapter is basically where I think Cronon begins to kind of show his lament about how heavy the industry was. On 225, starting with 217, really talks about how the depletion of the bison in this area exploded because of the creation of a city like Chicago. Meat packing and everything else, especially before, concepts of keeping the meat safe to eat. I'm not sure why I couldn't think of that. But also just talking about the sheer brutality of it. He describes, people either being extremely awestruck at the possibilities that industry provided. Even this woman who's standing in a pool of pig's blood and, hog head lying near her feet, just kind of seems amazed by it, whereas others could just be completely mortified. And, examples of this can be found on 225, 217, on 213, he talks about how the nature of the construction of stockyards really helped distance people from the act of killing itself. And as this is approaching terminal length here, basically after that kind of reconnects the concept of how country and city are intertwined by talking about central place theory. But I guess at this point I can move into a certain amount of critique. Now, and a discussion of dialectics as well. But starting with critiques, we have this concept that works throughout this book of first and second nature. Now, admittedly, Cronon does say that, this is kind of the formulation that I'm using. It's not always perfect, and I agree. I agree because I'm not sure how, humans can stand outside of first nature. As I was talking about with Brodell, there's precious little man can actually do, right? To influence his surroundings. It's the land that allows the development of new routes of transportation, more efficiency, the elevator tech. All of this stuff comes first because the environment allowed people to think so. So, and does man exist outside of nature? Not really. I don't think. I know what you're thinking that too, but So I critique him on that because I think that by separating first and second nature, Cronon is basically allowing himself to show just a sadness, I guess, about the depletion of, this environment around Chicago and moving into the Great West. I think that he sees, from the taking of the land, from the Potawatomi to the brutality to the animals in the stockyards, to the depletion of the white pine. All of these things are a sense of loss throughout the book. And I feel like by putting man into second nature, it's a critique of industry and capitalism and all of these things, and which is perfectly fine to make. I think that the book would have been more successful in its classification if he had just, come out and said that directly at the beginning. But, that's fine. Now, on how this book relates to the dialectic. It is kind of built into the structure of the book, but I feel like he kind of gives an example to sum it up, moving at page 14, where he's talking about the different impressions of Chicago on two gentlemen whose names are Garland and Sullivan. Now, he talks about Garland. Garland fears Chicago, seeing nature, in Cronon's words, as the symbol of a non-human creation damaged and endangered by the city's growth. While Sullivan loves the city and thinks of nature as a non-human power this time, not creation, which allowed the city to essentially be, called into being and to offer people opportunities to do great things. So you kind of have that agrarian world meets industrial world, and how you view the city will be determined based on how or which side of the fence you lie on. It can either be a good thing or a bad thing. And when these two opposing opinions can come together, we can kind of debate on what new knowledge really comes out of that. I don't think that there's a clear answer. I think Cronon's definitely in the camp of salvage, but and as he has every right to. I'm certainly not going to disagree that we should take action and notice in our second nature what we're really doing to first nature. I think that this book being written in 91 is kind of telling that we're not reading about climate change and the destruction of the planet. We're really reading about those concepts as applied to a single city, where hopefully future historians will take notice of this and continue to write about the importance of making sure we don't kill ourselves in the future. But yeah, that'll be it for me for today, but I can't wait to discuss more about the book tomorrow.